welcome to the Digital Classicist seminar, the last one this year. Lieve Donnellan is a very good expert in using computer software tools for analyzing the early urbanization in the 8th century in Italy. There is, I think I have read a little bit, there is a big discussion about whether it can be called colonization or not, and I hope that she will shed some light on this discussion point. Lieve had made her bachelor in art history and archaeology in the University of Ghent. She's Belgian, and did her master in classical archaeology as well in Ghent. Then the promotion, that is the promotion. And then she had a postdoc in Chicago at the Department of Classics. After this, again, a postdoc at the Georg August University in Göttingen. And now she's at the Free University in the Netherlands as well in a postdoc position. She had some other, her research topics are the Greek colonization, I put it in brackets, as well as intercultural interaction and network analysis, and the Greeks at the Black Sea, and as well the archaeology of Great Greek and Sicily. I think that we were gonna hear today as well a little bit about the necropolis of Pitikousai, which is an interesting landscape as well as I have heard, and so we will talk about the necropolis, I think, and as well our epoch will be the 8th century before Christ. So I will give over the word to Lieve. Thank you for being here, and we wish you all a nice hour.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to present some of my research, which is now a 2-year project funded by Marie Sklodowska-Curie, to be complete, fellowship from the Horizon 2020 action. So it's still work in progress. I'm just over the middle of my project. So the aim is to apply digital technologies to study the problem of the early urbanization in Italy. So I will combine network analysis and GIS analysis. I won't be saying much about the GIS analysis today because I've just started, I'm just starting. However, I will be talking about the network analysis part, which is well in progress. So as Marcus said, it's 8th century. Actually, urbanization phenomena start as early as the beginning of the first millennium before Christ. So it's, let's say, a couple of centuries. In the 8th century BC, we have dramatic transformations. So I will briefly say how I see network analysis as an archaeologist. I have a little bit a particular approach, my own approach, some methods I devised myself. And then I will say briefly something about urbanization. What is urbanization? Why is it interesting to study? And then I have actually 4 case studies. So Pitikousai is one of the case studies I study. But as I will come to say, I have reasons to look in a broader regional context. And then I have obviously some ideas for where this research could go to. So network analysis, I don't know if there are any archaeologists here in the room who don't know what it is, but it still happens to me that people ask, oh, what is network analysis? So basically, very briefly, data are represented as nodes and ties, and the way these nodes and ties make a structure, we call that network. The shape of the network determines how information flows. So if A in the very top wants to contact B, has to go through a whole series of nodes. In this network, there's no communication because it's disconnected. And here, there is communication possible. However, this node has a very crucial node in passing the information. And from these very basic definition, a whole range of sciences has adopted network approaches. So neural networks to organizational economics, they all use the same concepts and the same methods. Historians use network analysis. There's a very famous case of Patchett on the Florentine marriages in the 15th century. And of course, archaeologists. So network analysis in archaeology is absolutely not new. It has been used since the 60s actually, but it's, well, let's say roughly a decade that it's really accelerating and that much more work has been done or is being done. So there are some excellent case studies. There's the work of the group of Barbara Mills. They're studying pre-Hispanic southwestern culture, and they use sites and the material similarities between sites. And do you mind if I close the door? Okay. So another case is Emma Blake, an excellent work that has been done on late Bronze Age Italy, also looking at sites and at prestige objects at these sites and how the exchange of these objects shapes a network that seems to coincide with the later regional, well, cultures and identities. Other very interesting things that have been done, Anna Koller, well, has published a book, several articles on the formation of Jewish identity, how this is shaped and the link with the temple destruction. The work of Carl Knappert with his research group on interaction in the Bronze Age in the Aegean. So he applies predictive models to see how this could have happened. So network analysis has definitely been applied with a lot of success to various archaeological case studies, and they mostly focus on connectivity, so regional exchange, movement through physical space. So there is a very heavy spatial aspect in current archaeological network approaches, and it's also a macro approach, so very, let's say, top-down, talking about regional interaction, about very broad perspectives. As I will come to say later, I'm a little bit different in this sense that I try to descend to, let's say, a lower level, a more daily life level of interaction. So also in urbanization, urban studies, modern urban studies, as well as studies of cities in the past, network analysis has been used. There's, for example, the excellent work of Hannah Stoger in Ostia. She has looked at space syntax, at movement through Ostia, and where what kinds of spaces would be frequented more. That's a little bit in line with what has been done by urban scholars on urbanity. They look at transport networks and access to health services, and so on and so forth. A very important study that has been published on urbanization, specifically the early urbanization, so the same period I am looking at, and networks, has been the work of Francesca Fulminante from Cambridge. She made a network out of known sites in Etruria, so it's north of Rome. She also looked at the sites around Rome, and she built a network out of known roads and rivers and, well, physical possibilities to move through the landscape, and then looked at the size of the settlements and tried to connect the size of the settlement with the place within the network. And what she found, that there are changes through time, through the to the nodes, to the road network, and the movement and the interaction via the roads. However, what does not really happen in these studies is problematizing cities. So we use the word city to describe a reality, the reality of Berlin versus Göttingen versus New York. Well, no need to say that. That actually hides very complex and very diverse realities. Interestingly enough, even antiquity, I think these are very nice quotes, even in antiquity, thinkers already realized, or historians already realized, that there's a huge diversity to cities. So there's this very nice quote from Thucydides saying that cities, it's not the walls. He says men make the city and not walls or ships without men in them. And Pausanias, interestingly, traveling around, making a description of the things he observed on his trips. And he refers to Panopeus, a city of the Phocians. He says, if one can give it a name of a city, to those who possess no government offices, no gymnasium, no theatre, no marketplace, no water descending to a fountain. Although he adds that they have boundaries with their neighbours and even send delegates, and they have a name. So that seems to him some sort of criterion to say, yes, this could be a city. So, and like Thucydides, I want to know the city as a people, so not just the physical thing. And that's more in line, actually, what the current field of urban studies is looking at. So it's an interdisciplinary field trying to look at the reality of a city from very different perspectives. Here you see from a recent manual, a German manual, by the way, where they some sort of listed different disciplines and their contribution to this one reality we call city and the different ways they look at it. Architectures look at the build space, economists at relational processes, archaeologists look traditionally at the remains. And indeed, that's the way that archaeologists have looked and still look at cities mostly. So they ask questions about where were the city walls, where was a theatre, and so on, where was the necropolis. And the rise of cities or urbanization processes were very heavily embedded in a colonial discourse or in a foundation discourse. So Rome was there because Aeneas founded it, or Romulus and Remus were the ones who caused the foundation of Rome, or Athens existed because Theseus united them. But it should be clear that today scholars need to ask just slightly more complex questions to the rise of cities. And interestingly enough, actually, the concept of ancient city was already problematized in the 19th century. So a very famous book was written by French Numa Fustel de Coulanges, and he actually was a teacher of Durkheim, Émile Durkheim. And the thesis of Fustel de Coulanges that religion is actually the foundation of the city, of city life, even in ancient Greece and Rome, when we also see that resonating in Durkheim's work. But of course, Durkheim was not the only sociologist to talk about ancient cities. Max Weber has also dedicated some of his work, or at least some of his chapters, to ancient cities. Marx has written about ancient cities. Simmel has written about ancient cities. So it was actually a topic that early sociologists were really interested in, mostly from an evolutionary perspective or a comparative perspective. And it was until, let's say, the 1950s, until a really novel approach was introduced to ancient cities. And that was the very famous archaeologist Gordon Childe, who wrote an article in the Town Planning Review, and he saw cities as a true revolution. So as the result of a dramatic rise of population, suddenly people felt the need to reorganize economically and socially. So they changed, and that happened in different parts of the world. So he adopts, let's say, a world historical perspective. Before this came very trendy, so now everyone is basically doing world historical perspective. He already did it in the 1950s. But Gordon Childe is most famous for the checklist he made. So let's say physical characteristics archaeologists could use to decide whether a site was a city or not. So you see a number of things, so the size and economic specialization, if there were taxes, public monuments, a ruling class, arts and sciences, writing and trade, and so on. New approaches to Mediterranean urbanization were, well, perhaps quite slow to pick up. So this Gordon Child idea then became quite popular with people doing survey and trying to detect sites and very much working on settlement size and so on. But let's say 1997 and from then on, increasingly several books have been published with very innovative approaches to cities, and I just show two. The one is very recent, I haven't even read it yet. It was published here as part of the Topoi cluster, and it seems to have some chapters with very exciting, innovative approaches to cities, so I'm very much looking forward to reading that. And other innovative work on early urbanization or early cities stresses, let's say, the distinction between the physical space, state formation, also indigenous agency in colonial contexts, regional trajectories into the development of cities, alternatives to cities, and so on, also psychological experiences of city life. So very interesting things, and it is in this, let's say, new way of looking at cities that I'm also trying to do my own research. So my research region is Campania, which is here, region south of Rome. And the map that is shown here is a traditional, let's say, map that tries to summarize the cultural situation in the late Bronze Age, beginning of the early Iron Age. So you have the colors here. The yellow colors are the sites that belong to the so-called pit tomb culture, as the name says. This was a culture where people were buried in a pit, and the red sites are part of the Villanova culture, so you see a typical assemblage, and these were people that cremated their dead. So, and then the very traditional story goes that these were, in the mountains there were also some locals, so these cultures were probably originally there, then came from Etruria, the Villanova culture, they descended, and the traditional discourse is they founded new settlements that evolved into cities. And then it's not shown on the map, but then the story also goes that the Greeks arrive here, found a colony in Pithecusae, found a colony in Kuma, they basically kill off the natives and found cities there. From the Greeks, the notion of city would have fed into the Italian cultures. However, this has now completely been abolished because important work has shown that there are already dramatic changes in the late Bronze Age and in the early Iron Age. So we're now talking about the end of the 2nd millennium BC, early 1st millennium BC. So in the late Bronze Age, there is already formation of complex sites of stratified societies, probably with the aim of mediating the interaction with the Mycenaeans, who come there and trade prestigious objects. So the natives, the indigenous groups get organized and also get, let's say, chiefs to manage this. But then once the Mycenaeans collapse, the society collapsed in the 12th century, there are also changes in Italy. So what archaeologists have detected is that many of the Bronze Age sites disappear and new settlements are founded. They're fewer. But interestingly, what has been observed is that several of the settlements, of these dispersed settlements, are founded in places where later cities will develop. So this is an example, a very nice example of Chiusi, which develops into an important Etruscan city. So archaeologists have found that at several places there were probably very small settlements, a couple of houses with tombs around them, connected to these small groups. Well, exactly in this location where the later city would develop. So the idea is, has been formulated by scholars that somehow in the 8th century these nuclei aggregate form some sort of proto-city. They call it a proto-urbanization, which is not yet a city with monumental characteristics, although there are reasons to question this definition, as I alluded to earlier. But there is at least already concentrated settlement. And this concentrated settlement is linked to princes, to the appearance of an aristocracy, of rulers of this city. It has been noted that warriors or at least some, let's say, distinction between richer and poorer existed, but it's not really very pronounced. And then there would be this rush to increasing complexity as a process of urbanization. And indeed that seems the case also in Campania. And one of the sites that is best studied in this sense, in this process of urbanization, is Pontecagnano, which is near Pitagusai, also on the coast. So they know that the ancient city was here in the center. They found several here, the grey areas, graveyards, and they assume they've not excavated them. Very few huts have been excavated, but they assume that the different necropoleis were associated with small settlements that came together in late 8th century. Process continues in the 7th century, and that this was a phenomenon that coincides with very rich tombs, and you see an example here, like tombs with a wealth of objects. This extreme wealth found in the tombs has made archaeologists call them princely tombs. And that's a phenomenon that actually even stretches in the whole of Europe. Also in Germany, you have princely tombs. You have them, well, later in the Iron Age, you also have them in Belgium. So it's a very interesting, actually, European phenomenon. A very interesting and important study has been the quantification of tombs, of objects in tombs. And this is a work done by Maria Assunta Cuozzo. And she has made a rarity index of objects. So these princely tombs will have very rich, very scarce objects, and she has tried to quantify that to study the rise of inequality and disappearance of the princes. Unfortunately, the raw data were never published, so it's very difficult to compare it. But I'm also working with published data from Pontecagnano, so it's very interesting to compare the different observations. So another study, also a site I include in my own analysis, is Capua. Also becomes a very important Etruscan city, very close to Cuma, the Greek colony. And Gianluca Melandri has quantified tombs. He has done correspondence analysis, also made an index based on rarity of the objects, all with the aim of tracing this rising inequality in the tombs. And also at Pitagusai, quantification has been done. That's more the occurrence of objects in correlation to rites and shapes of the tombs. So it's very interesting work, and let's say a basis of understanding we can say we have about urbanization. So there's a rise of complexity, and there is also an increasing inequality socially and materially. However, there are many things we don't know. Was the evolution linear from simple to complex? How did this happen? So yes, indeed, it gets more complex, that's quite obvious, but how and why? Can we say something about the integration of the nuclei? So we know something about the role of the elites, but what about the rest of the population? the comparative perspective between Greek and Etruscan. So I show here an image from previous work I've done. So what Marcus alluded to was actually my PhD research about Greek colonization and the links with the model cities. And I applied another network model, also a two-mode network model, but one that looked at cultural affiliations of the objects. And one thing I discovered by looking systematically at the cultural affiliations through time was that in the very beginning of these so-called Greek colonies, there was actually nothing Greek at all. So there was mostly native, almost only native objects, native funerary behavior, which led me to the conclusion that these so-called Greek colonies were actually dramatically transforming native societies that received a lot of Greek migrants, of course, and as a result of this interaction, transformed. But the question I came up, and that's the reason I decided to do a new project about it, these Greek societies need to be seen in their regional context. So they experience dramatic processes of transformation and appearance of cities that might possibly be importantly linked to the transformation of these later Etruscan cities, but we don't know anything about it. And one of the reasons is that usually Greek archaeologists look at the Greek stuff and Etruscan archaeologists look at the Etruscan stuff, and they don't talk to each other. So it is important to apply the same methods to the data sets and compare. So that's one of my main aims to do. And also at a deeper theoretical level, I want to look at materiality of interaction and negotiation of power. So include the whole set of anthropological theories. So how do we do that, and how can we apply a network model to that? Actually, it's not so revolutionary because it's basically an extension of the existing statistical approaches. Many of the algorithms that are used in standard network packages are also the ones that are used in correspondence analysis or others. However, network analysis provides us, as I believe, with new ways of measuring importance of nodes. So this whole way of looking at structure and the links between types of information provides us with new insights. And I find that the two-mode model I have devised, is easier to connect to a body of theory that we call, well, actor network theory or materiality theory. So in that way, it's much easier to move from your data sets to an informed conclusion. So I have tried to draw how I understand, let's say, interaction and what archaeologists can find. So what I believe that archaeologists can do is detect communities of practice at a meso level. So people live and communicate together based on what they perceive is some kind of mutual understanding with other people. And often this set of this understanding, or let's say the common understanding, is formalized as cultural values with rules and laws. And material culture is used to facilitate this interaction and sometimes also clearly to embody it. So I have tried to translate this into a network model, and it's a two-mode, what specialists call a two-mode network model, in the sense that we have nodes of different characteristics. So I use the archaeological information which comes from publications like that. I insert it into a database and I organize the data in such a way that I have one mode is a tomb. I will immediately say something more about that. And in the other mode I have tomb-type objects, rites, and other characteristics that are found in these tombs. So tombs are basically our only data sets, which seems limited, but actually tombs were very important. Burial was a very important socio-cultural context at that time, because it was the main context for social reproduction, at least in most Western proto-historical, prehistorical societies. So burial was the occasion where group memory was reproduced or produced, where politics were played out, where identities were constructed. And it was also the opportunity where objects were produced for, were circulated, and were deposited. So from these groups we have no temples, no other, let's say, monumentalized structures, or even, let's say, context of deposition. So the tombs are really essential to understand what's going on in these societies. So the kind of questions we can ask is, how does the development to more complexity goes? Is it linear or not? We can trace inequality. We can look at trends. Well, just see whether there are marked changes through time that we possibly can correlate to things that happen, especially spatially, although I won't say anything about that today because the analysis is still going on. So, and we can link objects to practice, which is also important. So these are my case studies to situate them on the map. And I've essentially made these kind of networks of the different settlements and see what is going on. And very interesting, we're looking here at the first phase, and what we see already is this separation. So this principal component layout in the program UCINET, which is a program I prefer because it has already excellent ways to work with two-mode networks. It's something that other programs do not provide us with. Being an archaeologist and not a mathematician, I need to, let's say, use ways that other people have devised to do network analysis. So the distinction that the principal component providers with is exaggerated. So we need to keep that in mind, that groups are formed based on a number of characteristics defined in the algorithm, so it might not be the reality. But however, it's interesting to see that in this case it relates probably to gender. If we take a network from the same phase, the same reality that becomes later the city of Capua, we see a completely different reality in a necropolis nearby. So there is here, we see marked differences actually between the tombs. Although here in the center, interestingly, there are some, let's say, common objects that appear. Regretfully, we don't have a lot of context from every necropolis. However, the information we have is quite informative, as we see that we have here a tomb with a lot of objects. And some objects really provide bridges between different groups. So some objects really are mediators of embodied practices, of embodied funerary practices. So if we then move to Pontecagnano, the other side, we see differences. So also here, not that many objects in these necropolis. Here we see a number of tombs with a lot of objects. We have to be careful in this data set, as not all tombs are very well dated, and this is really a problem. I can't really go in detail, but I essentially have used tombs that are, let's say, we have data about but can't date very well, so I include them in different periods. Tombs that are not coherent contexts I have excluded from the analysis. Interesting here, in the same time, we see a similar phenomenon as in Capua. We see a clear distinction between two groups, a lot of nodes, also a lot of exotic objects. Nodes with single with single ties or only a couple of ties. However, in the center we see these, let's say, central values. It's also going on in the other necropolis in Pontecagnano, so this separation, although interestingly here it does not seem to be really related to gender, so we can't really connect to gender-specific objects. Usually jewelry or weaving implements are more connected to gender females, not necessarily biological females, and weapons are most often connected to men. Although it's problematic, it's not a discussion. We can perhaps talk about that in the discussion. One of the other necropolis has a completely different pattern, but we see quite some inequality, despite here the core being much, let's say, much frequented in terms of paths. In the second phase, something is happening. So you can clearly see that here many more objects suddenly appear, but the core becomes much, much, much denser. And we will briefly look at the metrics in the end, but we can really see this, and it's a trend that also appears in the other sides.
Could you just say what's the meaning of the red and blue dots?
So it's a different nodes. So these are the objects. It's quite small. You can't really see them.
Which object? Which object?
Well, it's quite small. Is it possible to enlarge a little bit? So the red are the tombs, and then the node labels list the objects. Well, it's in Italian, so but I can translate if you have it.
What are the blue ones?
The blue ones are the objects.
What does it mean? Are there relations between red dots?
Yes, of course. So that's the model. So
what does it mean, the relation between graves?
They were found together. So that's the model. The model I showed you.
Okay, but it's in necropolis, okay.
Yes, so it's
it means by itself that they found together.
Yes, so it makes the similarities. It shows the similarities between the objects that are shared in the tombs. So the tombs have, let's say, cups and bowls and swords, and the network shows how these objects are shared through the different tombs.
So it's not objects, but object types.
Yes. For this I have used, although in my analysis, although I won't show it here because it would bring us too far, you can do this at different levels. So you can use the typologies, the objects. I will show some slides where I show the performance that goes with it. So it's a different way of looking at the objects, not just the object as a type, because it's not so relevant in a way whether the cup has one handle, two handles. What people do with the cup is important. So, but I will come to that.
While we're at it, could you also briefly say what a principal component is, actually?
Yeah.
Well, the principal component is an algorithm that makes a layout. So in the program, it calculates which nodes are closer together. So based on the characteristics, the program groups the nodes closer together when they are similar. So if they're closer together, they share more similarities than when they're further apart. Yes?
So that all nodes appear also in the principal component, only in a different way?
So the nodes, the blue nodes here, the objects that are more important, so these are more shared by the red nodes than these. So this one has only one tie to this one. So I'm afraid I can't, I'm terribly sorry, it's not, yeah. I will try to look. So let's say
should we stand up and move to the wall?
if it's, but I have problems even myself to see it. It's a shame that the resolution is not really good. Well, but there's a whole variety of objects. The objects in the center are the most common ones, and these are, I don't know by heart for this case because I find it also, I'm terribly sorry, difficult to see, but usually the objects that are more shared are drinking cups, drinking vessels, feebly, exotic things, like things that occur only once. Some have a sword, for example, and these are the notes on the sides. A sword, an axe, a pincet, a razor. So these tombs contain a wealth of different objects. And if they're on the outside and have only one type, this means that they occur only once or twice in the tombs, whereas these objects are the ones that appear most in the tomb. So if you would compare it to a traditional histogram of frequencies of objects, you would get these objects as a very high, let's say, diagram, and these would be the ones that are the very low ones because they don't occur a lot. The advantage of the network analysis is that it shows them together, because if you make just a diagram of occurrences, you don't know what appears together. And the whole point of the network analysis is to show what the meaning is of things that appear a lot or not. So the structure of the network is very important. Also, groupings are important. If you see that a lot of the red dots of the nodes of the tombs are separated from each other, and if you can link that to attributes, to characteristics, like gender or age or something else, in some cases there seems to be a clear separation. That's Kuma, actually. I will show that. No, that's later, never mind. Sometimes it seems to be linked to inhumation, cremation, so let's say a ritual meaning between these tombs. So it's trying to find the variables that determine the differences. So in Kuma we don't have, again, a very good dating of the tombs, but it is also interesting that as we see here, it's not very close together, so there are differences. Although here in the center there are a number of objects that are shared by everyone, and that can be linked to what anthropologists call a community of practice, of things that have been done repetitively in the past. In Pitukusai, again, here we see a very nice distinction between the groups. So these are together because they share characteristics in the way they were made by the people who buried their dead. And the separation here seems to be linked to inhumation, cremation, which is very interesting because that actually confirms traditional observations that have been criticized by more innovative archaeologists. So there seems to be some ground of truth in a number of hypotheses that have been doubted recently. So people might have to look at them again. The third phase is the phase of the so-called princes, the moment that we have these proto-urban realities. And here we see that tombs have many more objects, and a number of them are shared. Here again, the fat lines mean that they occur more often. So there are a number of objects that are really, really, really popular among people, but we also see that there's a lot of difference between people, and some tombs really stand out because of their richness. So that seems to confirm this pattern in network terms, which shows that the model really shows what also other methods shows, and shows that it is really helpful for us to use. Here again we see this enormous diversity. This is three of these very, very wealthy tombs. So trying to see if I can read it. Well, this is scodella, it means a bowl. Here I see aribalos, which is, well, for the archaeologists, no, Greek perfume vessel. This means inhumation. Kassa is a box, let's say, made of stones in which that person was buried. I can't read them all. I'm terribly sorry. Scalpello is a scalpel, so it's a tool and it's linked to prestige, expression of prestige among the Etruscans. So also here in Pitokusai, we see actually a very different pattern. So you really see the distinction between the Etruscan practices and the Greek practices. So if we look at the metrics, so for the non-network specialists among you, you can measure the general characteristics of these networks, and that says something about how many nodes, how many ties, the overall similarity between them. In terms of this, let's say, rise to complexity, we actually see that, interestingly, the density, what was suggested by the traditional hypothesis, so that there were simply more objects, which is true, but what we also see is that because of the decrease in the radius, in the diameter, that actually the tombs become more similar to each other in a number of practices they execute. So that shows that there is something very interesting going on that is contrary to what people always thought. So there are many more things we can do with this network analysis. So we can look at affiliations, the 2-to-1 modes, and look, I will immediately show some of the other measures, very few, because time does not allow to say much more about it. We can also put them together and look at how the different sectors are integrated. We can look at performance, I will immediately say something, and then include things as time and space, and compare to random networks to see whether the patterns we have are random or whether there was some kind of probable intention behind the deposition. So this is, well, regretfully also not very readable, but this is a network where I've extracted, I'm terribly sorry, where I've extracted the objects out of the network. And the size of the objects shows how often they occur, they are shared between two tombs. So it's what network analysts call a measure of importance of a node within the network. So it helps us look at objects less in a human-devised way of rarity index, as other archaeologists have used, but within the whole context of the network, how important, how shared it is. And you see that for this particular case, I just show one example because we don't have time to look at it in detail. But it shows that there is indeed a node completely disconnected from the rest of the network. There is another one that actually stands out, so doesn't share a lot of similarities with other objects in terms of deposition. And then there's here a number that are very popular. So we can say, based on the objects that are more frequent, more popular, we can see what people actually did and connect that to subgroups. So, and this is regretfully also, I'm very sorry that you can't really read it. So, but what I did here is, instead of look at the shapes of the objects, I look at what people did with it. So, for example, fibulae, jewelry, are dress items or items for bodily adornment. So if you do that systematically, look at the importance of bodily adornment, of drinking vessels, of pouring vessels, we can understand better what people did around the tomb. So if we have a lot of jugs or pouring vessels,
but it's in the college, not around the time?
No, but these objects are supposed to be used, they're not just gifts for the dead. So anthropological work has shown that feasting practices around tombs has also been attested in written sources that...
There are no written sources for this now.
No, it's much later. It is later. But it is... based on anthropological theory, at least suggested that the objects were carried to the tomb, of course, but probably also with the liquids that were stored in the vessels, for example, a storage jar. That we don't know exactly libations, but if we find jugs, if we find liquids, let's say that the informed hypothesis is that there were at least some ritual actions performed with the objects that were used for them, that they just didn't, let's say, throw in an oinochoe not to make a libation to the dead, because we know that indeed from later sources that these kind of actions were very important. Or even the dress items, when we find them in a tomb, we might assume that dressing out the dead body was something that this group of people at that time thought was very important. So, because we find these objects, of course, otherwise they wouldn't be there. So there are a number of historical observations we can make. Important is that from the earliest phase there's clearly inequality in place. And this is contrary to what people have assumed until now. And in some cases we can link this inequality to gender differences. Which is interesting because traditional theory, also traditional hypothesis, assumed that gender differences became much more pronounced in a context of the city. So that was something that came after the 8th century. But if we now see systematically that it was something that was very much existing also in these previous phases. What we see also through time in the second phase is that there seems to be much more emphasis on codification of burial rites. So there are a number of objects that become suddenly much more important. It's, let's say, difficult to connect that really to a real explanation, but it seems indeed based on what is happening, that it becomes important to these people to behave a certain way, despite the new objects that we see appearing, like depositing the real set of objects became important for a lot of people. So having the cup, having the bowl, having the storage jar in the tomb, we see became much more frequent in this second phase. Something that dissolves much more in the third phase. We see that despite the fact that a lot of new objects were introduced, the memory practices surrounding the tomb remained in place. So some people have suggested that it was a revolution that happened, these new memory practices, these new objects in the third phase, but the existence or the continuation of the practices linked to the objects is not that new. So we can actually say that it is a transformation rather than a revolution.
Are there objects found outside the graves? You're talking about memory practices that should happen outside, done by the living. Have we really traces of that what these people did, or have you just the graves and the...
So there is the physical structure of the tomb, so the tumuli remains, or markers remain visible for quite some time. Some are still found in place.
Okay, you're talking about memory practices.
Yeah. There are also tombs, well, not all have been documented or excavated to the same extent, but there are indeed clear attestations that there were revisits to the tombs, and that was also an opportunity deposit new objects. Very often this was a jug, referring to the libation. This was a jug or a cup. Might have been used for libation or for passing, let's say, a symbolic share of drink, or just leaving it as a gift. So that is clearly attested. Also, I couldn't go into detail into that, but what happens, at least in the later Etruscan cities, so Cuma and Capua and Pontecagnano, is that a number of tombs are not overbuilt and they receive a clear visibility, and there seems to be a construction of a public space around them, which should suggest that there is a change in the commemoration of a certain number of dead people. And this is linked to the rise of these princes, and they are seen therefore as the rulers of the city, as an elite that it becomes more firmly established. However, the fact that in earlier phases we already have not the same but similar practices suggests that it is not such a revolution. So we see the same objects deposited in handmade ware, and then we see the same or similar shapes, but then in a Greek form. So they look nicer, but essentially what was done with them was still the same. So they were still depositing cups and vessels to pour. They had a different shape and yeah, were Greek, were more exotic, but the practices were very much related. Whereas in the Greek cities, the importance of burial actually decreases completely. So it's very much
Could you repeat this?
The importance of burial. So what we have, for example, in Eretria, also in Athens, in Argos, is in the late 8th century very rich tombs, which are connected to a pre-polis reality of an elite, of a ruling elite, of the basileis of the city. And to use perhaps a politically incorrect word, but what the rise of the polis reality entails is that the burial is transformed as a context for political action, for elite competition to the sanctuaries. Although that in Eretria you have at least for perhaps 10, 20 years an overlap between the two contexts. So you have already the Apollo sanctuary in existence in Eretria, while at the same time in the Western Gate you still have very rich burials, elite burials. So it is not a clear abolishing of the burial practice in these Greek contexts, and an immediate transfer to the sanctuary as this scene for competition, for memory, for construction of group memory. The sanctuary is taking that over, and it seems that in the Greek cities in Italy, at least Cuma, Pithecusa, where I've looked at, there seems to be a similar thing going on. So that seems to be one of the innovations that we can say that the Greeks are likely to have introduced there. Because there's one very rich tomb actually contemporary in Cuma and Eretria, but after that the extreme wealth that is displayed in Cuma is, like in Eretria, at more or less the same time abolished, which is a very interesting practice. So one of the explanations might be because of the development of new industries at the coasts. This is one of the things that the Greeks, also the Phoenicians, introduced, is perfume production, wine, perhaps not so much the production, but shipment, the distribution, and also the production of drinking vessels and cups. So they really set a new fashion. And one of the reasons that we see a centralization in the other sides is because people are trying to get more organized. So an increased supervision and taxation inland to organize exchange of these new products that they clearly want. So we see an influx of new products, and the desire to exchange what they could claim as a surplus, to exchange that for the other objects, the products that have been made by the Greeks, is at least my hypothesis, is behind the drive. So not really a change in authority, because I believe that was very much in place already. So the methodological observations is that network analysis allows to make more detailed observations. So we have more metrics we can look at, we can be quantitative, we have these centrality measures that tell us new things about the importance of objects. And there's really a huge potential to look at level of typology, for example, the distribution of the objects within the networks, but also include more detailed chronology, include more attributes, age, gender, in as far as we know it, because it's often quite problematic. And it clearly allows much better, as other quantitative methods, of course, it allows a much better way of comparing sites that are traditionally classified as different cultures. There are, of course, drawbacks and complications, apart from not being able to read the label sometimes. But there are no ready-made conclusions, so you can't have network analysis without a proper theory in place. So just making networks in itself doesn't really tell you a lot. You need to connect them to broader socio-cultural phenomena. We need to do much more on what it actually means. So there has a theoretical framework for network analysis has not been formulated. So that's a lot of work that still needs to be done. What does it mean, centrality in a two-mode network, in a context object-related network? Several people using that, but we need to think whether we can make a better definition than the ones that we use now, we adopt now, sometimes without critic, from sociology. And also, technical limitations still exist, so the program I use and the other programs that are around have been developed for sociologists. So yes, we can use it for archaeology, and yes, it is informative, but good would be if we had our own tools, our own methods. So, but luckily there's a very lively network community in archaeology, so we are very much working on that. So, but perhaps you have suggestions, so I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.